January 17, 1918, Schenectady, New York. Inside a locked laboratory, engineers stood before a machine that burned hotter than molten steel, a reactor glowing electric blue, pulling an invisible element from thin air. Outside, across the Atlantic, millions of artillery shells were being fired every day. Each one required nitrogen. And America had none. Germany had mastered synthetic ammonia years ago. Their chemical plants turned air into explosives, feeding the war machine even as British blockades strangled their ports. They believed this monopoly would cripple any nation that dared challenge them. But the Germans had miscalculated one thing: American desperation breeds American innovation. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, military planners discovered a terrifying truth: without ammonia, the guns would fall silent within months. There was no time to steal German secrets, no time to build their refineries. So General Electric did the impossible: they resurrected an obsolete process, built reactors that consumed the electricity of a small city, and ripped nitrogen molecules apart with sustained lightning. This is the story of how America refused to accept that the sky was empty, and turned air itself into ammunition. January 17, 1918. Schenectady, New York. The air outside the General Electric Research Complex was sharp with winter cold, the kind that made breath hang in clouds and steel tools stuck to bare skin. Inside Building 5, behind triple-locked doors and beneath vaulted ceilings blackened with soot, a different kind of cold prevailed, the sterile chill of a laboratory where men worked in leather aprons and asbestos gloves, their faces illuminated by the electric blue glow of arc furnaces burning at temperatures that could vaporize iron. The hum was constant, a low industrial hymn that vibrated through concrete floors and into the bones of every engineer present. They were not building weapons. They were not forging armor. They were doing something far more desperate, far more essential. They were trying to pull nitrogen from the sky. Outside those walls, the Great War had devoured Europe for 3.5 years. By the winter of 1918, the artillery barrages had grown so constant that soldiers in the trenches could no longer distinguish individual explosions. The thunder had become a singular, endless roar. Every shell, every grenade, every bullet fired in anger depended on one element: nitrogen. Locked into the molecular structure of TNT, cordite, and smokeless powder, nitrogen was the invisible backbone of modern warfare. And nitrogen, in the form needed for explosives, came from ammonia. Germany had solved this problem years earlier. Under the direction of chemist Fritz Haber, the German Empire had mastered the Haber-Bosch process, a method of synthesizing ammonia directly from atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen under extreme pressure and heat. By 1914, Germany's chemical plants were producing hundreds of thousands of tons of synthetic ammonia annually, feeding both munitions factories and agricultural fertilizer programs. The blockade imposed by the British Royal Navy had cut Germany off from Chilean saltpeter, the world's primary natural source of nitrogen compounds. But it hadn't mattered. Germany's scientists had made the nation self-sufficient. They had turned air into explosives. America, by contrast, had no such capability. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the military planners in Washington confronted a terrifying arithmetic. American factories could build the rifles, the artillery pieces, the ships. American steel mills could roll the armor. But American chemists could not produce the ammonia needed to keep those guns firing. The nation's entire supply of fixed nitrogen depended on imports, Chilean nitrate shipped across submarine-infested waters, and a trickle of byproduct ammonia recovered from coke ovens as a secondary consequence of steel production. It was not enough, not remotely enough. If the war dragged into 1919, if the German spring offensive succeeded, if the U-boat campaign intensified, America risked running out of ammunition before its armies ever reached the front. This was the crisis that brought the engineers to Schenectady. This was the problem that had no room for failure. The scientists at General Electric had not expected to become saviors of the war effort. GE was a corporation built on light bulbs and electrical turbines, on the Edison legacy of practical innovation for civilian life. But the men leading its research division, Willis Whitney, William Coolidge, Irving Langmuir, understood that the line between peace and war had dissolved. The government had come to them not with a request, but with a challenge bordering on desperation: find a way to make ammonia. Any way, fast. The Haber-Bosch process was off the table. It required high-pressure reactors operating at 200 atmospheres and 500 degrees Celsius, catalysts of osmium and uranium, an industrial infrastructure that would take years to construct. Germany had spent a decade perfecting it. America had months. So the GE engineers turned to a different method, one older and less efficient, but faster to deploy, the electric arc process. The principle was elemental. Nitrogen gas, which comprised 78% of Earth's atmosphere, was chemically inert, almost impossible to coax into reactions under normal conditions. But if you forced it through an electric arc, a sustained lightning bolt burning at 3000 degrees Celsius, the sheer violence of the heat would rip nitrogen molecules apart and fuse them with oxygen to form nitrogen oxides. Dissolve those oxides in water, and you could produce nitric acid. Combine nitric acid with ammonia, or synthesize ammonia directly from the oxides through reduction, and you had the feedstock for explosives. It was brute force chemistry, inefficient, energy-hungry, costly. The process consumed more electricity than a small town. But America had electricity. America had waterfalls and coal-fired generators and a grid that spanned continents. What America did not have was time. By February 1918, the first pilot reactors were operational. They were monstrous things, cylinders of refractory brick 10 feet tall, lined with copper electrodes that glowed white-hot when the current surged through them. Engineers fed compressed air into the base of each reactor, and the arc, sustained by 10,000 volts, tore through the gas stream like a blade through fabric. The nitrogen oxides produced were faint, rust-colored gases, toxic and corrosive, captured in condensers and scrubbed through chemical baths. The yield was low. The energy cost was staggering. But it worked. The German High Command had anticipated many things when they calculated America's entry into the war. They had accounted for American industrial capacity, for the flood of fresh troops, for the logistical advantage of a nation untouched by bombing raids. But they had not accounted for this, the speed with which American ingenuity could compensate for scientific disadvantage. German chemists had assumed that without the Haber-Bosch process, the United States would be crippled, dependent, vulnerable. They had assumed that control of ammonia synthesis would remain a German monopoly, a trump card that would dictate the pace and terms of the conflict. They had assumed wrong. By the spring of 1918, GE's experimental reactors were scaling up. The War Industries Board authorized the construction of a full-scale ammonia synthesis plant at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where the Tennessee River's hydroelectric potential could feed the arc furnace's insatiable hunger for power. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock. Blueprints were redrawn weekly as new problems emerged: electrode erosion, gas leaks, cooling failures. Men died in industrial accidents, crushed by machinery or burned by chemicals. Their names were not recorded in the newspapers. The project was classified. The German soldiers advancing through the Marne Valley in May 1918, convinced that one final push would break the Allied lines before American reinforcements arrived in force, did not know that behind the Atlantic horizon, nitrogen was being conjured from the air in quantities sufficient to sustain a war of attrition for years. They did not know that the shells screaming over their heads in July, fired by American artillery batteries newly arrived in France, were loaded with explosives synthesized in reactors that had not existed 6 months earlier. The symbolism was accidental, but perfect. Nitrogen, the invisible, inert gas that drifted through every breath, ignored and abundant, had become the fulcrum of industrial survival. To the German chemists who had pioneered ammonia synthesis, nitrogen represented mastery, control, the triumph of German Wissenschaft over the limitations of nature. But to the American engineers at Schenectady and Muscle Shoals, nitrogen represented something else: adaptability. The willingness to take a discarded, inefficient process and scale it to functional desperation. The refusal to accept that any resource, no matter how inert, was beyond reach. The electric arc process was never elegant. Even after the war, when the Haber-Bosch patents were seized as reparations and American chemical companies built their own high-pressure ammonia plants, the arc reactors were quietly dismantled. They had been a stopgap, a crisis measure. But they had worked. In the 12 months between early 1918 and the armistice in November, American factories produced enough fixed nitrogen to supply not only the military, but also the civilian agricultural sector. Farmers who had faced fertilizer shortages in 1917 found themselves with surplus by 1919. The same nitrogen that fed the guns also fed the wheat fields. This duality would become a recurring theme in the American industrial experience of the 20th century. The technologies developed for survival in war, radar, synthetic rubber, penicillin, would transform civilian life in peace. But in 1918, there was no time for philosophy. There was only the hum of the arc furnaces, the acrid smell of nitrogen oxides, and the knowledge that every ton of ammonia synthesized was another day the war could be sustained. The German chemists who reviewed captured American ordnance in late 1918 were puzzled by the isotopic signatures in the explosives. The nitrogen ratios were inconsistent with Chilean nitrate. The trace impurities suggested a thermal synthesis route, not biological. Some suspected the Americans had stolen the Haber-Bosch process. Others believed it was a bluff, that the ammunition had been stockpiled before the war. None guessed the truth, that the Americans had resurrected a process dismissed as obsolete and brute-forced it into functionality through sheer electrical excess. By the time the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the strategic lesson had been absorbed by every major power. Ammonia synthesis was no longer a luxury or a competitive advantage. It was a prerequisite for sovereignty. Nations that could not produce their own nitrogen were nations that could not sustain modern warfare, or modern agriculture, or modern existence. The invisible element that drifted through the atmosphere, inert and inexhaustible, had become the most contested resource on the planet. The engineers who had worked in Building 5 at Schenectady returned to civilian projects, light bulbs, radio tubes, X-ray machines. Few of them spoke publicly about the arc reactors. The technical papers were published years later, dry and clinical, stripped of urgency. But the lesson endured, encoded not in words but in infrastructure. The lesson that no resource is truly scarce if you are willing to spend enough energy, enough creativity, enough brute persistence to claim it. There is a photograph from 1919, taken inside the Muscle Shoals plant after the armistice. The arc furnaces are cold, the electrodes retracted, the reactors silent. A single engineer stands in the frame, his hand resting on the copper casing of a reactor, his face unreadable. Behind him, through the open bay doors, the Tennessee River flows wide and slow, its hydroelectric turbines still turning, still generating the megawatts that had powered the synthesis. The caption, typed on the back of the photograph, is brief, war work completed. But the work had not been completed. It had been postponed. The same reactors that pulled nitrogen from the air in 1918 would become the conceptual ancestors of processes far more consequential, the centrifuges that would enrich uranium, the reactors that would breed plutonium, the industrial megastructures that would underwrite the Cold War. The logic was identical: take the invisible, the inert, the supposedly inaccessible, and force it into utility through the application of overwhelming power. The German military theorists who studied the American performance in World War I came away with a troubling conclusion. The United States had entered the conflict unprepared, lacking the chemical infrastructure that Germany had spent decades constructing. And yet, within a year, America had closed the gap, not through espionage, not through diplomacy, but through a willingness to accept inefficiency as a temporary cost. The arc process was wasteful. It consumed more energy per ton of ammonia than any other method. But energy was what America had. Energy was what America could afford to waste. This would become the defining asymmetry of the 20th century. Where other nations optimized for scarcity, America optimized for abundance. Where other nations built systems designed to conserve, America built systems designed to overwhelm. The electric arc reactors at Muscle Shoals were not a triumph of elegance. They were a triumph of scale. By the 1930s, the Muscle Shoals plant had been repurposed for civilian fertilizer production, the arc furnaces replaced by Haber-Bosch reactors built with German patents seized after the war. The Tennessee Valley Authority, created during the Great Depression, absorbed the facility as part of its broader electrification and agricultural modernization mandate. The reactors that had synthesized nitrogen for explosives now synthesized nitro for cornfields. The nitrogen that had sustained the war now sustained the peace. But the memory of 1918 lingered. Military planners understood that ammonia synthesis was not merely an industrial process, it was a strategic bottleneck, a single point of failure that could determine the outcome of any future conflict. During World War II, American ammonia production would scale to unimaginable levels, driven by the same hydroelectric and coal-fired infrastructure that had powered the arc reactors. By 1945, the United States was producing more fixed nitrogen than the rest of the world combined. The German soldiers who fought in both world wars, those who survived to reflect on the pattern, came to recognize a persistent feature of their American adversaries. The Americans did not arrive with the best weapons, the most refined tactics, or the deepest reserves of experience. But they arrived with excess. Excess steel, excess food, excess fuel, excess ammunition. And when they lacked a critical capability, like ammonia synthesis in 1918, they did not ration or conserve. They built new infrastructure, at crushing cost and impossible speed, until the lack became a surplus. This was not superiority in the traditional sense. It was not the superiority of craftsmanship or discipline or inherited expertise. It was the superiority of surplus, the ability to throw resources at a problem until the problem ceased to exist. The arc reactors at Schenectady and Muscle Shoals were never commemorated with monuments. There were no statues of Willis Whitney or William Coolidge in public squares, no plaques marking the sites where nitrogen was first pulled from the air on American soil. The work was too technical, too invisible, too distant from the mud and blood of the front lines. But the work had mattered. It had mattered more than 100 battles. In the decades that followed, as the Haber-Bosch process became universal and ammonia synthesis became routine, it became easy to forget that the capacity to make nitrogen had once been a desperate, uncertain gamble. It became easy to assume that the nitrogen compounds that fed the world's crops and filled the world's munitions had always been abundant, that the air had always been a limitable resource. But the engineers who had stood in Building 5 in the winter of 1918, watching the arc furnaces burn and the nitrogen oxides condense, knew better. They knew that abundance was not natural. It was constructed. It was willed into existence by the refusal to accept scarcity as final. There is a line from a GE internal report, dated March 1918, written by one of the supervising engineers during the early trials of the arc process. The line is mundane, technical, almost dismissive in its brevity. Yield remains low, but nitrogen is free. Nitrogen is free. 4 words. But in those 4 words lies the entire logic of American industrial power in the 20th century. The raw materials, nitrogen, silicon, uranium, information, were abundant, often freely available in nature. The challenge was never scarcity. The challenge was energy. The challenge was the willingness to spend electricity, labor, capital, and time on the brute force transformation of the abundant but inert into the scarce but useful. The German war planners in 1918 had counted on America's lack of ammonia synthesis capacity to limit the scale and duration of American intervention. They had built their strategy around the assumption that certain technologies, certain capabilities, were gate-kept by knowledge, by expertise, by patents and secrecy. They had not accounted for the possibility that America would simply bypass the gates. That America would look at an inefficient, discarded process and say, "This will do. Make it bigger." And they had made it bigger. By June 1918, the Muscle Shoals plant was producing nitrogen oxides at a rate sufficient to supply half of the American Expeditionary Force's ammunition needs. By September, full production. By November, when the war ended, the plant had synthesized more fixed nitrogen than the entire Chilean nitrate industry had exported to the United States in the previous year. The war ended before the full potential of the arc reactors could be realized. But the infrastructure remained, the knowledge remained, and the lesson remained, that no nation could claim to be a great power in the industrial age if it could not command the nitrogen cycle. Food, explosives, fertilizer, propellants, all depended on the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. Germany had learned this lesson first, in 1914, when the British blockade forced the invention of the Haber-Bosch process. America had learned it second, in 1917, when entry into the war revealed the fragility of dependence on imports. And every other nation would learn it in turn, building their own ammonia plants, their own fertilizer factories, their own stockpiles of nitrogen compounds. The arc reactors were a footnote, but they were a footnote that mattered. They were proof that American industrial capacity was not constrained by the limits of existing knowledge, but only by the limits of available energy. And energy, in a nation with rivers to dam and coal to burn and oil to pump, was the one resource that seemed, in 1918, almost infinite. The engineers who dismantled the last of the arc reactors in the early 1920s, hauling away the blackened electrodes and the cracked refractory bricks, did not know that they were dismantling a prototype of a way of thinking. The logic of the arc process: spend energy to overcome inefficiency, scale up the inelegant until it becomes functional, would reappear again and again. In the aluminum smelters of World War II, where electricity replaced scarcity with surplus. In the uranium enrichment cascades of the Cold War, where brute force separation replaced chemical finesse. In the data centers of the 21st century, where computational power replaced human labor. But in 1918, there was no grand theory. There was only the problem, no ammonia. And the solution, pull nitrogen from the air. January 17, 1918. The arc furnaces hummed. The nitrogen flowed. And somewhere across the Atlantic, in the trenches and the factories and the command rooms where the war was calculated in tons and casualties and logistics, the balance shifted. Not visibly, not immediately, but it shifted, because the Americans had refused to accept that the air was empty. They had looked at the sky and seen a reservoir. They had looked at inert gas and seen explosive potential. They had looked at a crisis and seen only a problem of scale. And they had scaled. The epilogue is written in the fields. In the Iowa cornfields that stretch to the horizon, fed by nitrogen synthesized in vast Haber-Bosch plants descended from the desperate improvisations of 1918. In the wheat fields of Kansas, where fertilizer made from ammonia quadrupled yields and fed a global population that would have starved under the agricultural constraints of the 19th century. The nitrogen that was pulled from the air in 1918 to sustain a war now sustains the peace. The same element, the same transformation, only the purpose has changed. And the lesson, encoded in the hum of the reactors and the glow of the arc furnaces, endures, that scarcity is a choice, that the invisible can be made visible, that the inert can be forced into utility, that the air, empty and infinite, is not empty at all, only waiting for someone desperate enough, or bold enough, or reckless enough, to claim it.